March 1, 1954. Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands, 6:45 m. local time. Dr. Alvin Graves stood on the deck of the USS Estes, positioned 40 miles from ground zero, and watched the countdown clock tick toward zero. As scientific director of Operation Castle Bravo, he'd calculated the yield of this new hydrogen bomb at approximately 6 megatons, a respectable advancement over previous tests. The weapon represented America's answer to Soviet thermonuclear capabilities, a carefully calibrated demonstration of power. The numbers on his clipboard told a story of precision. 15 megatons of TNT equivalent contained in a device weighing 2,300 pounds. Deliverable by B-52. Strategically meaningful, militarily sufficient. At precisely 6:45 a.m., the weapon detonated. What Graves witnessed in the next seconds would haunt him for years. The fireball expanded far beyond projected parameters, swallowing the sky in a brilliant white light that burned through protective goggles. The mushroom cloud climbed not to the expected 75,000 feet, but rocketed past 130,000 feet, penetrating the stratosphere like a fist through paper. The shockwave, arriving as a physical blow, made the Estes shudder despite its 40-mile distance. Graves frantically rechecked his calculations as reports flooded in. The yield wasn't 6 megatons. It was 15 megatons, 2.5 times more powerful than predicted. A miscalculation in lithium-7 fusion had created the largest nuclear detonation the United States would ever conduct. Radioactive fallout began drifting toward inhabited islands. Japanese fishermen on the Lucky Dragon were already being showered with deadly ash 75 miles away. As Graves watched the column of fire climb toward space, a single thought crystallized. We've built something we don't fully understand. And if we don't understand this, what else are we building? The answer, it would turn out, was far worse than he imagined. In the paranoid calculus of the early Cold War, the concept of enough nuclear weapons was fundamentally absurd. Curtis LeMay, head of Strategic Air Command, captured this mindset perfectly in 1957. If I see that the Russians are amassing their planes for an attack, I'm going to knock the shit out of them before they take off the ground. In this worldview, superiority wasn't measured in sufficiency. It was measured in the ability to annihilate your enemy so thoroughly that retaliation became physically impossible. President Eisenhower, despite his famous warning about the military-industrial complex, presided over an unprecedented expansion of the nuclear arsenal. In 1953, the United States possessed approximately 1,200 nuclear weapons. By 1960, that number had exploded to more than 18,000. We could not afford to permanently maintain military forces of such size and cost as to be able to defend every part of the globe from attack simultaneously, Eisenhower explained to his National Security Council. Therefore, we had to be prepared to use atomic weapons in all forms. The logic was circular but compelling. Because conventional forces were expensive, nuclear weapons must compensate. And because nuclear weapons were relatively cheap to produce once the infrastructure existed, why not make them as powerful and as numerous as possible? Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev embraced similar reasoning, though from a position of initial weakness. The imperialists are trying to frighten us with their nuclear weapons, he declared in 1956. But they cannot frighten us. We too have nuclear weapons, and we have missiles to deliver them. Behind the bluster lay a more uncomfortable truth revealed in classified Soviet military assessments. The USSR's nuclear arsenal in the mid-1950s was dramatically inferior in both quantity and sophistication. The solution? Compensate through sheer destructive power. We decided that the most reliable deterrent was to make several superweapons and test them in a public fashion. Soviet nuclear physicist Andrei Sakharov later recalled. The idea was that even if we had fewer weapons, each one would be so devastating that the Americans would think twice. This strategic thinking led directly to the development of weapons like the RDS-220, better known as Tsar Bomba, a device so powerful that its designers worried it might ignite the atmosphere. Both sides convinced themselves that extreme overkill served rational strategic purposes. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara articulated the American position in 1965. Assured destruction means the capability to inflict an unacceptable degree of damage upon any aggressor or combination of aggressors at any time during the course of a strategic nuclear exchange, even after absorbing a surprise first strike. The Pentagon's calculations determined that unacceptable damage meant destroying 25 to 30% of the Soviet population and 50% of industrial capacity. What neither side publicly acknowledged was that this goal could be achieved with a fraction of existing arsenals. A 1961 Rand Corporation study, classified for decades, concluded that 400 nuclear weapons strategically targeted would effectively destroy the Soviet Union as a functioning society. By 1961, the United States had more than 24,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviets, playing catch-up, had approximately 3,300. The overbuilding wasn't just about warheads. It extended to delivery systems that bordered on science fiction. In 1957, Air Force Chief of Staff General Thomas White testified before Congress about plans for the X-20 Dinosaur, a nuclear-armed spaceplane that would orbit the Earth, dropping atomic bombs on demand. The military man, White explained, has a professional obligation to visualize and recommend military applications of vehicles which can patrol space. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers drew up plans for fractional orbital bombardment systems that would place nuclear weapons in low Earth orbit, enabling surprise attacks from any direction, including over the South Pole, where early warning systems didn't exist. Marshal Rodion Malinowski, Soviet defense minister, described it as an orbital weapon that can circle the Earth indefinitely and strike at a time and place of our choosing. Intelligence assessments on both sides fed the paranoia. CIA reports consistently overestimated Soviet capabilities, most famously in the Bomber Gap and Missile Gap scares. Khrushchev exploited these fears brilliantly, parading the same few missiles through Red Square multiple times to create the illusion of vast nuclear forces. Eisenhower, privy to U-2 reconnaissance photos showing the true weakness of Soviet forces, found himself politically unable to reveal the truth without compromising intelligence sources. The result was a strategic arms race, built partly on real competition and partly on imaginary threats. Both sides designed weapons not for any coherent military purpose, but to counter weapons the other side might theoretically develop. The Air Force commissioned studies for 1,000 megaton weapons, devices that would create radioactive wasteland the size of Texas, simply because Soviet scientists had hypothetically discussed such yields. The thing to realize, recalled Daniel Ellsberg, a Rand analyst who helped shape nuclear strategy in the early 1960s, is that nobody really believed we'd use these weapons, but everybody believed the other side might. So we kept building them, because what if we were wrong? The origins of Cold War overkill trace directly to August 1949, when American B-29 reconnaissance planes detected unusual atmospheric radiation over the Pacific. Atomic Energy Commission scientists analyzed filter samples and reached an inescapable conclusion. The Soviet Union had successfully tested a nuclear weapon, years ahead of American intelligence estimates. President Truman faced immense pressure to respond. "We must have more bombs and better bombs," insisted Senator Brian McMahon, chairman of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, in November 1949. The solution came in the form of a technological leap, the hydrogen bomb, a fusion weapon theoretically thousands of times more powerful than the fission bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Edward Teller, the brilliant and controversial physicist who would become known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, had advocated for fusion weapons since 1942. In principle, he wrote in a memorandum to J. Robert Oppenheimer, there exists no limit to the explosive power that might be released. Oppenheimer, haunted by his role in creating atomic weapons, opposed the superbomb on both technical and moral grounds. It is a weapon of genocide, he told the Atomic Energy Commission's Advisory Committee in October 1949. Truman overruled him. On January 31, 1950, the president announced, I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the so-called hydrogen or superbomb. The first American thermonuclear test, Ivy Mike, took place on November 1, 1952, at Enewetak Atoll. The device, weighing 82 tons and requiring a refrigeration system to keep its liquid deuterium fuel at cryogenic temperatures, was more laboratory experiment than deliverable weapon. But when it detonated with a yield of 10.4 megatons, it vaporized the island of Elujalab, leaving a crater 6,240 feet in diameter and 164 feet deep. The mushroom cloud reached 57,000 feet in 90 seconds. Mike was a success, recalled physicist Frederick Rains, but it was also terrifying. We'd moved from destroying cities to erasing them from existence. The Soviets matched America's H-bomb breakthrough remarkably quickly. On August 12, 1953, just 9 months after Ivy Mike, the Soviet Union detonated RDS-6s, their first thermonuclear weapon, at the Semipalatinsk test site. Though smaller than Ivy Mike at 400 kilotons, the Soviet device had one crucial advantage. It was deliverable by aircraft using solid lithium deuteride rather than liquid fuel. Andrei Sakharov, who led the Soviet fusion program, understood the moral implications immediately. After the test, he recalled in his memoirs, we were taken to the local military commander's quarters to celebrate. I raised my glass and said, may all our devices explode as successfully as today's, but always over test sites and never over cities. The commander stared at me in shock. My remark was regarded as inappropriate and seditious. The Castle Bravo disaster of March 1954 should have prompted both superpowers to reconsider the wisdom of ever larger weapons. The 15-megaton explosion contaminated 7,000 square miles of the Pacific, exposed 239 Marshall Islanders to dangerous radiation levels, and poisoned the crew of the Japanese fishing vessel Lucky Dragon No. 5, killing radio operator Eikichi Kuboyama. Lewis Strauss, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, initially tried to dismiss the incident, suggesting the Japanese fishermen were Russian spies. The cover-up collapsed when independent scientists measured dangerous fallout across the Pacific. Instead of restraint, both sides accelerated. The Pentagon commissioned Project Sundial, a theoretical weapon so powerful that some calculations suggested it could ignite the atmosphere. While Sundial remained theoretical, the Air Force proceeded with operational weapons barely less extreme. The B-41 thermonuclear bomb, developed in the late 1950s, had a maximum yield of 25 megatons, more than 500 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. It weighed 10,670 pounds and could be carried by B-52 bombers. The military ordered 500 of them. General LeMay championed even more ambitious projects. In 1957, he pushed for Project Pluto, a nuclear-powered cruise missile designed to fly at treetop level for months, distributing nuclear weapons across the Soviet Union while spewing radioactive exhaust. The missile's unshielded reactor would kill anyone beneath its flight path, even before it reached its targets. The notion of scattering radiation all over the landscape, recalled one Pentagon official, didn't seem to bother Curtis much. The Navy contributed its own excess with the development of submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The Polaris program, initiated in 1956, aimed to put nuclear missiles on submarines that could strike from underwater, making them effectively invulnerable to first strikes. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, defended the program by arguing that the only way to prevent war is to have such overwhelming strength that no nation will dare attack us. By 1967, the United States had 41 ballistic missile submarines, each carrying 16 missiles, each missile carrying a nuclear warhead. The Soviets responded with their own submarine fleet and pursued ever larger weapons. In 1961, concerned about the American lead in deliverable warheads, Khrushchev authorized the construction and testing of the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated. The project, designated RDS-220 and nicknamed Tsar Bomba, was designed to demonstrate Soviet nuclear prowess at the 22nd Communist Party Congress. When we tested our 50-megaton bomb, Khrushchev later wrote in his memoirs, the West shit its pants. Sakharov, tasked with designing the weapon, grew increasingly troubled by what he was creating. In his initial design calculations, he proposed a 100-megaton yield but was overruled, not for humanitarian reasons, but because the test aircraft couldn't escape the blast radius. Even at the reduced 50-megaton yield, the bomb's designers feared it might crack the Earth's crust or trigger volcanism. Sakharov later called the test a pointless demonstration of strength that served only political purposes. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, both superpowers commissioned studies for delivery systems as excessive as the weapons themselves. The Air Force investigated nuclear artillery shells, nuclear depth charges, nuclear torpedoes, nuclear landmines, and nuclear anti-aircraft missiles. The Army developed the Davy Crockett, a recoilless rifle that could fire a nuclear warhead from a jeep-mounted launcher. With a yield of 20 tons and a range of 2.5 miles, the Davy Crockett exposed its own crew to lethal radiation if fired at maximum range upwind. We nuclearized everything, recalled Dr. Herbert York, the Pentagon's first director of defense research and engineering. If it moved or exploded conventionally, someone proposed a nuclear version. The logic was always the same. If a little explosive power is good, unlimited explosive power must be better. October 30th, 1961. Novaya Zemlya, Soviet Arctic. 11:32 am Moscow time. Major Andrei Durnotsev pulled the Tupolev Tu-95 bomber into a sharp turn the moment the massive weapon released. His co-pilot, Captain Ivan Klesch, watched the altimeter plummet as Durnotsev pushed the aircraft into a steep dive. Fleeing the impact point at maximum speed, they had exactly 188 seconds. Beneath them, suspended from an enormous parachute, fell a device unlike anything in human history. The RDS-220 Tsar Bomba measured 26 feet long and weighed 60,000 pounds. Its designers had constructed it with a lead tamper rather than uranium-238, deliberately reducing its theoretical 100-megaton yield to only 50 megatons. Even at half its design power, it would be the most powerful nuclear weapon ever tested, 3,000 times stronger than Hiroshima. Soviet engineers had calculated that the test aircraft needed to achieve a distance of 28 miles from ground zero to have a 50% chance of survival. 50%, Durnotsev had remarked during the mission briefing. Those are good odds for Russian roulette. At 13,000 feet above the frozen archipelago of Novaya Zemlya, the weapon detonated. The fireball alone expanded to over 3 miles in diameter, so vast that it appeared to touch both the ground and the bottom of the stratosphere simultaneously. Scientists at the Kurchatov Institute, monitoring from hundreds of miles away, recorded thermal radiation so intense it could have caused third-degree burns at 60 miles distance. Windows shattered in Finland, 500 miles from ground zero. The seismic shock wave registered 5.25 on the Richter scale and circled the Earth 3 times. The clouds beneath the aircraft and in the distance were lit up by the powerful flash. Durnotsev recalled decades later. The whole cloud was saturated with this orange, red, and yellow color. It was like someone had opened the door to a giant furnace. The mushroom cloud climbed to 213,000 feet, more than 40 miles high, punching through the stratosphere and mesosphere into regions normally occupied only by meteors and satellites. The shock wave nearly destroyed the Tu-95 despite its distance. The aircraft, coated in special reflective white paint to deflect thermal radiation, dropped more than 3,000 feet as the blast wave hit. Durnotsev fought for control as instruments flickered and metal groaned. Both he and Klesch would later receive the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, primarily for surviving. When Andrei Sakharov reviewed the test data, his worst fears were confirmed. "We'd proven nothing except our capacity for mindless destruction," he wrote in his private journal. The weapon had no conceivable military purpose. Its weight and size made it nearly impossible to deliver in combat. The fallout would contaminate vast areas regardless of where it detonated. And its psychological impact? The sheer terror it inspired. Only hardened positions on both sides of the Iron Curtain. President Kennedy received the initial intelligence report on Tsar Bomba on October 31st. His national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, found him staring at classified photographs of the mushroom cloud. "They're insane," Kennedy said quietly. "Or we're insane. Or the whole damn situation is insane." But Kennedy's response wasn't restraint. It was escalation. Within weeks, he authorized acceleration of the Minuteman ICBM program and expanded B-52 production. Defense Secretary McNamara presented plans for a nuclear arsenal of 10,000 strategic warheads, each independently targetable, capable of reaching Soviet territory within 30 minutes. The only sane response to insanity, McNamara argued, is overwhelming superiority. The madness reached its apex during the Cuban Missile Crisis just 11 months later. On October 27, 1962, Black Saturday, Soviet submarine B-59 found itself trapped by American destroyers in the Caribbean, unable to surface, running out of oxygen, with temperatures inside the vessel climbing past 120 degrees. Captain Valentin Savitsky, unaware that the blockade was not yet a shooting war, believed World War III had begun. "We're going to blast them now," Savitsky shouted to his officers. "We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the shame of the fleet." He ordered the submarines nuclear torpedo armed and prepared for launch. The torpedo carried a 15-kiloton warhead, equivalent to the Hiroshima bomb. Its use would almost certainly trigger full-scale nuclear war. Only the intervention of Commodore Vasily Arkhipov, the submarine's second captain, prevented the launch. "I will not authorize the use of nuclear weapons," Arkhipov said calmly, despite Savitsky's fury. Soviet submarine regulations required unanimous consent from 3 officers for nuclear weapons use. Arkhipov's vote blocked the strike. The Americans had no idea how close they'd come. On the surface, USS Beale continued dropping practice depth charges, intended merely as signals to force the submarine to surface. Neither side knew the other's true position or intentions. The world's nuclear arsenals stood ready, thousands upon thousands of weapons, each exponentially more powerful than necessary to destroy their targets. Theodore Sorensen, Kennedy's speechwriter, later reviewed classified documents showing that American commanders had standing authorization to use tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba without direct presidential approval. "We were one miscommunication, one nervous officer, One technical malfunction away from Armageddon, Sorensen concluded. And we had thousands of ways to accidentally end the world. When the crisis resolved peacefully on October 28th, neither superpower acknowledged the fundamental absurdity that had brought them to the brink. Both sides possessed arsenals capable of destroying the other multiple times over. The United States alone had more than 27,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviets had approximately 300. Any exchange involving even a fraction of these weapons would render victory meaningless. There would be no world left to rule. At the theoretical height of the missile crisis, calculated Carl Sagan years later, the two superpowers possessed sufficient explosive power to equal 1.6 million Hiroshima bombs, 1,600,000. We'd built weapons to destroy a planet we couldn't evacuate. Yet instead of scaling back, both sides continued building. The B-41 entered full operational status. The SS-9 Scarp, a Soviet ICBM capable of carrying a 25-megaton warhead, began deployment. Project Pluto, the nuclear-powered cruise missile, proceeded to engine testing despite growing recognition of its strategic insanity. Engineers actually built and tested the Pluto reactor at Jackass Flats, Nevada, where it successfully demonstrated sustained nuclear-powered flight while poisoning the test range. The paradox, observed Daniel Ellsberg, who had top-secret access to nuclear war plans throughout this period, was that everyone involved knew the weapons were excessive, but no one felt empowered to say stop. The momentum carried its own logic. We were riding a bomb we couldn't defuse. By the mid-1960s, both superpowers began recognizing, reluctantly, incompletely, that unlimited nuclear growth served no rational purpose. The evolution wasn't toward sanity exactly, but toward a different species of madness. Precision overkill replacing brute force overkill. The shift started with technology. In 1964, the Navy successfully tested the Polaris A-3 missile, which carried 3 warheads instead of 1. Each warhead could strike a different target, though they fell in a pattern rather than being independently targeted. Pentagon strategists immediately grasped the implications. Why build 3 massive 25-megaton weapons when you could build 1 missile carrying 3 smaller warheads, each still devastatingly powerful, but hitting 3 separate targets? Secretary McNamara embraced the concept enthusiastically, seeing it as both economically efficient and strategically superior. A 9-megaton warhead, he explained in a 1965 briefing, can destroy any city on Earth. 3 3-megaton warheads can destroy 3 cities. The choice is obvious. What he didn't add, but what Pentagon planners understood, was that multiple smaller warheads also overwhelmed Soviet defenses more effectively than single large weapons. The Air Force developed MIRV, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, by 1970. The Minuteman III ICBM, entering service that year, carried 3 independently targeted warheads. The LGM-118 Peacekeeper, developed in the late 1970s, would carry 10. Each individual warhead on a Peacekeeper had a yield of 300 kilotons, 20 times the Hiroshima bomb, and could hit within 400 feet of its target from 6,000 miles away. We'd gone from city busters to silo busters, recalled General Russell Dougherty, SAC commander, from 1974 to 1977. The accuracy meant we could destroy Soviet missile silos with smaller weapons, which sounds like progress until you realize we'd simply exchanged the ability to destroy everything inefficiently with the ability to destroy everything efficiently. The Soviets pursued their own MIRV programs, though from a position of technological disadvantage. Soviet MIRVed missiles tended to carry fewer, larger warheads with less accuracy. The SS-18 Satan, deployed from 1975 onward, carried up to 10 warheads, each with a yield up to 750 kilotons. American intelligence estimated that a single SS-18 could destroy an area the size of New Jersey. The Soviets built 308 of them. Simultaneously, both sides developed weapon systems that defied comprehension in their specificity. The W-54 nuclear warhead, America's smallest, weighed just 51 pounds with a variable yield from 10 tons to 1 kiloton. The Pentagon deployed it in the Special Atomic Demolition Munition, essentially a nuclear landmine carried by a single soldier. The idea, explained a formerly classified Army manual, is that Special Forces soldiers could parachute behind enemy lines, plant nuclear demolitions to destroy bridges or mountain passes, then escape before detonation. Former Green Beret officer John Mole Phillips, trained in the program, recalled the dark humor among operators. "We called it the one-way mission because the radiation would kill you before you got 10 miles away. But Army planners assured us we'd make it. They gave us lead-lined sleeping bags." The Navy, not to be outdone, deployed nuclear depth charges, nuclear torpedoes, nuclear cruise missiles, and nuclear anti-submarine rockets. The UUM-44 Subrock, for instance, was a submarine-launched rocket that would leap from the water, fly up to 35 miles, then plunge back into the ocean where its nuclear warhead would detonate, destroying any submarine within several miles. The Navy purchased 285 Subrocks despite the obvious question: in what scenario would you need to destroy a submarine with a nuclear weapon? I remember asking my commanding officer exactly that, recalled former submarine officer Kenneth Carr. He said, "Because we can, and because the Russians might have something similar." That was the entire strategic justification. Soviet nuclear development followed similar absurd paths. In the late 1960s, they developed nuclear artillery shells for their 203mm guns, with yields up to 2.5 kilotons. Soviet military doctrine called for nuclear escalation dominance, the ability to use nuclear weapons at every level of conflict. This meant nuclear weapons for tanks, planes, ships, artillery, even anti-aircraft missiles. The V-1000 anti-ballistic missile system defending Moscow carried nuclear warheads to destroy incoming American missiles. The logic was impeccable and insane. To prevent nuclear weapons from hitting Moscow, Soviet planners would detonate nuclear weapons in the atmosphere above Moscow. The fallout from successful defense, noted one CIA analysis, would be nearly as deadly as a direct hit. The arms race's economic impact became crushing by the 1970s. The United States spent approximately $500 billion on nuclear weapons between 1950 and 1980, in 1980 dollars. The Soviet Union, with a smaller economy, spent proportionally more. Entire cities existed solely to produce nuclear weapons: Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, Rocky Flats in America, Arzamas 16, Chelyabinsk 70, Krasnoyarsk 26 in the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of workers dedicated their entire careers to building weapons that everyone hoped would never be used. The paradox consumed us, recalled Dr. Harold Agnew, who directed Los Alamos National Laboratory in the 1970s. We were scientists. We knew the weapons were excessive. But we also knew that if we stopped building them, and the Soviets didn't, we'd be at a disadvantage. So we kept building. We built weapons to counter weapons that didn't exist, to threaten targets that weren't valuable, to fight wars that could never be won. Both sides also pursued weapons that were abandoned only because they exceeded the bounds of military utility, even in Cold War logic. The U.S. Air Force seriously studied nuclear-powered aircraft, reasoning that bombers with unlimited range could stay airborne indefinitely, eliminating vulnerability to first strikes. Test reactors for the program actually flew aboard modified B-36 bombers. The project was canceled in 1961, not because it was impossible, but because the unshielded radiation exposure would kill the crew on flights longer than a few days. The Soviets built an actual nuclear-powered cruise missile, the 9M-730 Burevestnik, which Western intelligence called SSCX-9 Skyfall. Test flights in the 1980s ended when the missile crashed, spreading radioactive contamination across Arctic testing grounds. The program was suspended, then revived decades later under Putin, a testament to the enduring appeal of excessive weapons. By the early 1980s, both arsenals had reached their peak. The United States possessed approximately 23,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had roughly 40,000. The combined explosive power exceeded 13,000 megatons, about 1 ton of TNT for every human being on Earth. Strategic planners on both sides developed targeting lists that included not just military sites and industrial centers, but collective farms, bridges, railroad junctions, and provincial government offices. We had target folders for villages of 2,000 people, recalled General George Lee Butler, who commanded U.S. strategic nuclear forces from 1991-1994. The targeting philosophy was that anything the enemy might conceivably use to recover from nuclear war should be destroyed, which effectively meant destroying everything. The peak of Cold War nuclear excess, the moment when the absurdity became impossible to ignore, didn't arrive with a bang, but with a briefcase and a satellite transmission. On November 9, 1979, NORAD computers detected 250 Soviet ICBMs launching toward the United States. Duty officers immediately initiated emergency protocols. At Strategic Air Command headquarters, klaxons shrieked. Across the American West, Minuteman missile crews received preliminary launch authorization. B-52 bombers at bases worldwide started engines, preparing for emergency takeoff. President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was awakened by a phone call informing him that nuclear war had begun. He was seconds away from calling Carter to recommend immediate retaliation when a second call came through. False alarm. A training tape simulating a Soviet attack had somehow entered the live system. 6 months later, on June 3, 1980, it happened again. NORAD computers showed 2,200 Soviet missiles inbound. For 6 terrifying minutes, the U.S. military prepared for Armageddon before technicians discovered that a faulty computer chip worth 46 cents had caused the error. We nearly ended the world twice because of technical malfunctions, Senator Gary Hart said after reviewing the classified incidents. We had 23,000 nuclear weapons on hair-trigger alert, and the safety mechanisms failed. The weapons worked perfectly. The humans and computers did not. But the true revelation of excess came from an unexpected source. Ronald Reagan, the president who would expand the nuclear arsenal to its greatest extent, 317 weapons by 1984. On October 10, 1983, Reagan watched a classified screening of The Day After, a television movie depicting the aftermath of nuclear war on Lawrence, Kansas. "It's very effective and left me greatly depressed," he wrote in his diary that night. "The film is powerfully done, all $7 million worth. It's very effective and left me greatly depressed." My own reaction: we have to do all we can to see that there is never a nuclear war. What depressed Reagan wasn't the Soviet threat. It was the realization that even limited nuclear exchange would effectively end civilization. The movie showed ordinary Americans dying not from initial blasts, but from radiation, starvation, disease, and societal collapse. The president who'd called the Soviet Union an evil empire began quietly questioning whether nuclear weapons served any purpose beyond preventing their own use. The nuclear winter studies of 1983, led by Carl Sagan and other scientists, provided scientific grounding for Reagan's intuitive horror. Computer models showed that even a limited nuclear war involving 100 weapons less than 0.5% of existing arsenals, would inject enough smoke and debris into the atmosphere to drop global temperatures by 20 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Agriculture would collapse. Famine would kill more people than the weapons themselves. We calculated that the Soviet Union and United States together possessed weapons equivalent to roughly 18,000 megatons, Sagan explained in testimony to Congress. To put that in perspective, it's the explosive equivalent of 3 tons of TNT for every person on Earth, or 1 Hiroshima bomb for every person in America. The biological consequences would be absolute. The peak excess wasn't just in numbers. It was in specific, targeted absurdity. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, SIOP, America's nuclear war blueprint, identified 40,000 targets in the Soviet Union and allied countries. Some targets appeared multiple times on the list to ensure destruction. Moscow alone had 60 weapons assigned to it. We would hit some targets 5 or 6 times, General Butler later revealed. Not because we needed to, but because different weapons systems claimed the same targets and nobody rationalized the plan. The Soviets matched American excess with bureaucratic precision. Declassified documents from the 1980s show that Soviet strategic forces planned to launch approximately 3,000 nuclear weapons in the first 30 minutes of any war. Their targets included not just American military installations, but also NATO air bases in Britain, Turkey, and West Germany, meaning nuclear weapons would fall on U.S. allies regardless of whether those allies participated in the conflict. The automaticity was what terrified me, recalled Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer who, on September 26, 1983, disregarded computer warnings of American missile launches. The system was designed to launch everything at once, because we feared American first strikes would destroy our missiles if we waited. But this meant any false alarm, any technical error, any miscommunication could trigger automatic retaliation. The human element, the judgment that maybe the warning was wrong, was almost eliminated. Petrov's decision not to report the computer warnings as genuine attacks, later revealed to be satellite reflections of sunlight, prevented what would have been the third near-miss apocalypse in 4 years. He violated protocol and regulations. A by-the-book officer would have triggered World War III. The cumulative cost of peak excess was staggering. The Brookings Institution calculated in 1998 that the United States spent $5.5 trillion on nuclear weapons and related programs between 1940 and 1996. The Soviet Union, which collapsed partly under military spending burdens, likely spent proportionally more. Thousands of scientists, millions of work hours, entire generations of engineers, all devoted to weapons that everyone agreed could never be used without ending civilization. The tragedy, observed McGeorge Bundy in a 1988 essay, is that we knew it was excessive while we were doing it. Kennedy knew. Khrushchev knew. Every president and premier understood that beyond a certain threshold, probably a few hundred weapons, additional nuclear capacity served no rational military purpose. But the domestic politics, the bureaucratic momentum, the military-industrial interests, and the fundamental distrust between superpowers made stopping impossible. The environmental damage alone exceeded most wars in history. Nuclear weapons testing by both superpowers between 1945 and 1992 released radiation equivalent to 40,000 Hiroshima bombs into the atmosphere. The Marshall Islands, Novaya Zemlya, Semipalatinsk, the Nevada test site, all became radioactive sacrifice zones. Thousands of soldiers, scientists, and local populations were knowingly exposed to dangerous radiation, their health sacrificed to prove weapons that would never be used. By 1986, when Gorbachev and Reagan met in Reykjavik, both leaders had privately concluded that nuclear arsenals served primarily to threaten mutual suicide. Their famous near agreement to eliminate all nuclear weapons scuttled over Reagan's insistence on continuing Strategic Defense Initiative research, demonstrated how close sanity came to prevailing. "We can do business together," Gorbachev told Reagan. The unspoken subtext: we can stop this madness. But they didn't stop, not really. Even as both sides reduced numbers, they improved accuracy and lethality. The W-87 warhead, entering service in 1986, packed 300 kilotons into a package accurate to within 400 feet. It was installed on Peacekeeper missiles, each carrying 10 warheads. One Peacekeeper could destroy 10 different cities or 10 different military targets. The United States deployed 50 of them. "We'd achieved the ultimate overkill paradox," concluded General Butler in his famous 1996 speech repudiating nuclear weapons. "We built weapons that were too powerful to use, too numerous to justify, too dangerous to maintain, and too expensive to afford. And we called it security." The legacy of Cold War nuclear excess lives on in ways both obvious and subtle. Today, 9 nations possess approximately 13,000 nuclear weapons, a dramatic reduction from the Cold War peak of 70,000, yet still enough to end human civilization multiple times over. The United States and Russia still maintain roughly 1,800 weapons on high alert, ready to launch within minutes. The fundamental madness persists, just at lower volume. The economic costs continue compounding. Cleaning up contaminated nuclear weapons sites will cost an estimated $500 billion over the next century. Rocky Flats, Hanford, the Nevada test site, and dozens of other locations remain dangerously radioactive. The Marshall Islands continue seeking compensation for the health effects of 67 nuclear tests that contaminated their homeland. Residents of Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, where the Soviet Union conducted 456 nuclear tests, show elevated cancer rates 3 generations later. Perhaps the deepest legacy is psychological. The Cold War normalized the possibility of apocalypse. An entire generation grew up knowing that civilization could end within 30 minutes. This constant low-grade terror-shaped culture, politics, and psychology in ways still being understood. "We learned to live with the unlivable," recalled Dr. Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who studied nuclear anxiety. "We developed psychological mechanisms to simply not think about the weapons pointed at us. That capacity for denial, for living with existential threat without confronting it, may be the Cold War's most dangerous inheritance." The technological excess found new applications, not all benign. MERV technology, developed to overwhelm Soviet defenses, helped create the satellite and space exploration industries. But the same technologies enabled precision strike capabilities that lowered barriers to conventional warfare. When you can hit a target within 10 feet from 5,000 miles away, wars become temptingly surgical. Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya learned this lesson. The bureaucratic and industrial structures created to sustain nuclear excess persist. The Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration still employs approximately 45,000 people and spends $15 billion annually maintaining the nuclear stockpile. Corporations that built Cold War weapons, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, remain defense industry giants. The expertise developed to create excessive weapons now develops new generations of smart weapons, autonomous systems, and potentially artificial intelligence-enabled warfare. "We dismantled the weapons, but not the thinking that created them," observed Andrew Cockburn, a defense analyst. The assumption that more technology, more precision, more capability automatically equals more security. That's pure Cold War logic. We're still operating from that playbook. The most bitter irony is that the weapons themselves were never the real problem. The B-41 bomb, the SS-18 Satan, even Tsar Bomba. These were symptoms, not causes. The underlying disease was the conviction that security comes from the capacity to destroy, rather than from addressing the reasons for conflict. Both superpowers built weapons to deter war while creating conditions that made war more likely. Hair trigger alerts, automated systems, apocalyptic contingency plans. Vasily Arkhipov, who prevented nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, never received public recognition from Soviet authorities. Stanislav Petrov, who prevented war in 1983, was initially reprimanded for not following protocol. The heroes of the Cold War weren't the generals who built bigger weapons or the scientists who created more destructive devices. They were the individuals who said no when systems and logic demanded yes. Today's world faces analogous challenges. Artificial intelligence weapon systems promise precision and reliability. The same promises that led to 23,000 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. Cyber weapons enable attacks without attribution, lowering barriers to conflict. Hypersonic missiles threaten to compress decision times even beyond Cold War extremes. The lesson of Cold War overkill, that security cannot be achieved through ever greater destructive capacity, remains unlearned. Back on that deck in March 1954, watching the unexpected fury of Castle Bravo, Dr. Alvin Graves understood something his superiors didn't want to acknowledge. They'd built something that exceeded not just necessity, but comprehension. The weapon worked exactly as designed. The problem was the design itself. That remains the ultimate lesson. The Cold War's most overkill weapons weren't technical failures. They were conceptual failures. They answered a question that should never have been asked. How much destruction is enough? The true answer, which took decades and trillions of dollars to learn, is simpler than any warhead calculation. Enough to deter is enough. Everything beyond that is excess. And in excess, we nearly found our extinction. The weapons are smaller now, fewer and more accurate. But until we abandon the logic that created them, the belief that security comes from the power to annihilate, we remain Dr. Graves on that deck, watching something we built but don't fully understand, hoping we never have to learn whether we calculated correctly. We got lucky. We got very, very lucky. And luck, unlike plutonium, doesn't have a half-life.